Hello and welcome to Teenagers Untangled, the audio hug for parents going through the teenage years. I'm Rachel Richards, journalist, parenting coach, mother of 2 teenagers and 2 bonus daughters. Now, whenever I put anything on social media about schools and exams, I get, shall we say, a vigorous response. I think it's fair to say that a lot of us are frustrated by the schooling system, frustrated by exams on behalf of our kids. And even those of us with kids who are performing at the top of the league tables probably have to admit that the way things are currently set up doesn't seem to be creating a healthy modern society, but we're not really sure how to fix it. It's coming to the end of the summer, as I record this, which means there's been a wave of exam results in the UK and the beautifully timed release of a terrific book called Examination: Why Our Obsession with Grades Fails Everyone. Written by Sammy Wright, head teacher of a secondary school in the north of England and part of the UK government's Social Mobility Commission for several years. It's been chosen by the BBC as Book of the Week and applauded by reviewers across serious newspapers in the UK. And I found it laugh out loud. Really, really funny at times. Sammy, thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with talking about you. One of the things you did in the book was you went around England talking to a lot of kids and asking them what they thought school was for. And what sort of reactions did you get to that?
I mean, like some of the reactions were just kind of blank-faced astonishment that I would ask such a stupid question. But once I got down to it, it was remarkably consistent. You know, they have a message which comes across loud and clear, which is school is for exams, school is for getting a career, school is for making sure you don't end up homeless, in the words of one slightly gloomy child. You know, and it's, to me, that's the real prompt for a lot of the stuff that I want to say, because none of those are the things that I think school is for.
Really? What do you think school is for?
Well, so the thing that I have found in my time at school is that, you know, I've been teaching for 22 years, and yes, a lot of the things that we do in school set you up for later life. That is true, but they don't have a direct causal relationship. So, for example, you know, when you talk to policymakers about school, they can often use this shorthand around, you know, grades equals money. Yeah, you know, get more
Yeah.
grades at GCSE and you'll do better. You know, we need to increase the skills across the country and we'll boost the economy. And actually, you do, if you just take a little moment and think about that, you realise how that is just not true. If you look at the kind of things that you can do with top grades, and if you take the most academically qualified people in the country, well, they are, by definition, academics. And they
Yeah.
certainly aren't the best paid, are they?
No, quite,
You
quite.
know, and,
Yeah, really good point.
and so that whole equation there, it basically turns what is a very, very complex and nuanced experience in school into a flattened economic equation.
And
And
it's transactional, isn't it?
exactly, and that's the
Mm.
word which becomes my kind of bête noire in the book, is the idea that, you know, everything has to be turned into a transaction, because ultimately, you know, the way I think about schools, it's a public good. It's like clean
Mm.
water or parks. You know, it's something that
Mm.
enriches the body politic. It makes us all live better lives if it works well. And if we reduce it to a transaction, then we're doing two things. On the one hand, we're saying, you know, everything's about money, which
Mhm.
I don't think is the right moral message to give to our children. But on the other hand, we're also offering people the choice. And we're saying, if it's a transaction, you choose to accept the transaction or you don't. And my experience with a lot of young
Mm.
people is that they look at the terms of that transaction. They say, well, that's not me. That's not aimed at me. That's not what
Wow.
I'm,
Yeah.
you know, it's not my experience of life. And therefore, school's not for me. And I think that's a tragedy.
And we're seeing increasing numbers of those.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And I think that, you know, there's two kind of camps that kind of child falls into, because I think there's children who are turned off school because, you know, for whatever kind of personal reason to do with their own capabilities and their understanding of the world, they don't connect with that argument. But there's also a kind of much harsher thing going on where in the most deprived areas of the country, the transaction that you're offering seems so far from the daily realities of life that kids encounter that they just think it's not real. And that's
Gosh,
a,
yeah,
a grim
that
thought.
makes so much sense, and that's tragic.
Mm.
And one of the things you talked about in the book was that really grabbed me was this transition from primary to secondary. Now, people are listening around the world, so we're talking about sort of a transition at about between 11 and 13, where kids leave their school, which feels sort of cozy and like a community, and then they go to a secondary school system, which in the UK is very much, you've got lots of different teachers, you're having to navigate your way around different parts of the building, and things are broken up into separate subjects. And I think you said that, the primary school teachers look at secondary school teachers and say, what did you do to them? Because because everything, I mean, obviously there are other things going on.
Mm.
And I always say to our listeners, please don't put too much pressure on your kids, during this period, because there's so much they're having to deal with that's so difficult. But you sort of highlight that as one of the key stages where things start to go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a bit more about why you say that?
Yeah, I
Or
mean,
am I right?
yeah, I think there's two reasons why I latch on to that moment. One is just the observational one, which is that so particularly with kids in the very deprived areas that form part of the catchment of my school. When they're in primary school, the school can operate in a quasi-familial way. So teachers are they parent the kids, but actually they also parent the parents. They engage with you in a very kind of direct and emotive way. And if you think of really basic things about primary school, like, for example, homework, primary homework is essentially not really homework for the kid to go and do. It's homework for the kid and the parent to go and do together. And that's
Interesting.
what a
Yeah.
lot of those
Yes.
projects when your kids in year 1 and 2 are actually about. And things like that requirement that primary schools make, of kind of parents reading with children. And they have little reading diaries. They ask for that because what they're doing there is they're actually trying to structure and guide the home environment. Once you get to secondary, there's a kind of, you lose that sense of the personal direct connection with the family. And secondary schools, I mean, in my own school, we really try hard to maintain very good relationships with parents. We do everything we can, but the mechanics of it are so different that it just becomes not possible. You don't have the single point of contact in the same way. You've got 12, 13 different teachers. It's set up in a completely different way. And that setup changes the emotional tone of the place, and it changes the, I think that kids have a kind of radar for who the kind of prime status person is.
Yes.
And they understand who is defining the terms of their social world. And young kids understand that as their parents, and they respond to that. And they go on the swing and they look up to mommy and daddy, and they smile because that's the approval that they're looking for. In primary school, the environment, the social world, is very, very controlled by the teachers, and it's very, very much on the teachers' terms. And if you listen to primary teachers, they'll often talk about, well, class, what are we doing today? And good morning, miss, and good morning, sir, and everyone chanting together. There's a lot of collective action. And in St. Matthew's, we do this, and this is the way we do things. And it's a really tricky thing, because obviously secondary schools, there is a need to move towards independence. But the nature of the way we have the system set up in the UK is that move is a very, very sharp one. And you go very, very quickly from that quite controlled social environment to one in which the kid looks for the person who holds the status and sometimes concludes that is their peers,
Yes.
or that is the older kids, rather than the teachers. Now, obviously, in an excellent school, that's not the case. Really good school leaders do control the social space, and they make a culture in which kids succeed. But there's a lot of danger that comes in that moment.
That's
But
fascinating. Yes.
yeah, and so the other thing I did want to say on that transition point is that actually, since finishing the book, I realized that a lot of the thinking that I did around the history of schools, I read some further stuff on it. And I realized that the thing that had been sitting in the back of my mind is that, of course, when we talk about universal education, we mean primary.
Right.
Secondary schools
Right.
are actually an evolution of selective education. And
Wow.
even though we now have comprehensive schools, the whole concept of secondary education is like the model it's built on is a selective model. And so, where in primary you've got all these structures which are about getting all kids together to a certain level,
Mm.
and that being a level that's about their kind of entitlement as citizens and young people. It's not about kind of who's the best and so on, although it does a bit of that, obviously. In secondary school, the deep structures of the school are about selection and about
Mm.
stratification and about ranking.
Yes. And once you say that, you start measuring everything, then what you're really saying is you're saying if it can't be measured, it's not of value.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love what you're talking about, because what's interesting to me is there are schools, some of which get a lot of flack and aren't liked.
Mm,
But, the Michaela Academy, which
mm,
is known for being much more, so it's a secondary school, but it's still got that very much that environment. And I think, is it the Reach Academies
yeah,
who
yeah.
also, where they sort of coach kids through this transition
Mm,
and keep them sort of, at meal times, you sit
mm,
together in
mm,
groups, and this is how
mm,
you, and I guess in a way, what we do is we go from primary socialization where kids are at home and they're learning from their parents, and then they're in the secondary school environment, and that becomes much more important. And if there isn't some kind of sense of community around them,
mm,
then obviously they're going to be looking elsewhere. And,
yeah.
and obviously online now
Mm,
becomes incredibly important as well as
mm,
as another dynamic in that.
yeah, and actually, so there's an interesting example which I don't discuss in the book there's a school in London called All Saints, which recently hit the headlines because they'd been arranging a 12-hour day, which was
Wow.
slightly kind of terrifying concept. But I talked to the head; he's a really lovely guy, and
Yeah.
basically what a 12-hour day actually is school and then clubs, and
Yeah.
the kids stay for dinner and they stay for breakfast at the start of the day. So
Oh.
it's a way of actually structuring the school day in a way
Yeah.
that um, caters for more than just the learning and the kind of
Yes.
the quote unquote curriculum. It's
Yeah.
actually kind of giving this wider spread, and that speaks to something else, I think, which is that going back to that idea of looking at the history of schools. We do have a really weird thing when we think about schooling, in that it's supposed to be the place that we put our kids, and yet it's really badly designed for that because no
Mm.
one's job actually fits school hours. So you have this
Oh,
thing
of
where,
course. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it effectively, we structure what we do with our kids in a way that suits a model of the family that's actually from the 50s, where you've got a stay-at-home mother who's able to pick them up from school.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And all the parents that don't have that are, I mean, I don't know how they cope.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, and I think what was fascinating was you right at the beginning of the book, I think you started thinking about this book as a result of what happened with COVID.
mm-hmm,
And I love the quote, when the grades were, so at that time, they weren't sitting exams. They
mm-hmm,
weren't even allowed into the schools. We were all stuck at home, and it was, I think nobody really understood how it was going to play out. But one of the things that came out of it was that, you go, well, we have to have some way of assessing whether these kids did any good at all. And the grades were then assessed in a different way, which was kind of based on what the teachers thought the kids should have got. And when the grades were released in the morning, this was August 2020, this is your quote, the normal joyous hysteria was replaced by an atmosphere of stunned fury.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Why? What was
Yeah.
why? Because this is at the nub of this. It's kind of like, do we have exams? Why do we have exams? And when you take away exams, obviously it was a panic situation and they were just doing what they could.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the result. So what
Mm-hmm.
was going on there?
So I think the emotional content of that moment was the lack of control.
Mm-hmm.
So there,
Mm-hmm.
the normal thing that you have, I've just literally done it this morning. I've been in my school and I've watched
Of course you have, yes.
yeah. So I've watched them kind of
Mm.
come in and they bounce around, they open their results, but fundamentally it's a conversation between them and their own experience. And so, when they do less well, they remember the exam that they sat and they go, oh, well, this and that, and they might think it's unfair, but equally they know that it was their experience. Whereas on that day, the thing that was so disorientating for everyone was that you just had this kind of diktat handed down from on high that this is your
Mm.
result. You thought it was this, but it's actually this, and you're totally out of control with it.
Yes.
And I think the thing that you'll know from the book that what happened in my mind from there is that I realized that sense of a lack of control is also what many kids have on a normal results day as well. So there is a kind of,
Wow.
it's all dependent on your own experience, because if
Yeah.
you are someone who, to take any number of examples, someone who's had a bereavement during your results, or someone who's been struggling with a very difficult home life, and you're battling through, and then you
Mm-hmm.
get to your results day, then often you have a lack of control there as well. Um,
Yeah.
and the really knotty thing that you get with this is taking away the exams was awful, right?
Yes.
But then having them in the way that we've got them is also really difficult. And it's,
And I think this is what everybody's
what do we
struggling with.
do?
It's like, it doesn't work, but
Mm,
does it? Is it not working? And I think
mm,
one of the points you make is that the way the school systems are set up at the moment with the grading patterns that we
mhm,
have is that it's designed so that someone fails.
mhm,
Because for people to win, people fail.
mhm,
And that is there's a stark contrast between that and the way that, for example, we have driving tests. If
mhm,
someone fails their driving test the first time, you don't say, oh, I don't think driving's for you.
mhm,
You say, go away, try, have another go.
mhm,
And then they come back and they learn and eventually
mhm,
they get good at driving.
mhm,
And these are core skills that people may or may not need for their life, but so is maths and English.
mhm,
And
mhm.
it's an interesting concept. So what um, do, is it possible to have a system of grading where you don't have people who necessarily fail?
Yeah,
In order,
I think there are several different options that one could look at, but I think the first thing I would say is that what you've got to do is kind of separate off the different functions of what an exam system does, and you can actually see this very easily in the names of our different qualifications. So you have your general certificate of secondary education, which you do at 16, and then your advanced level, which you do at 18. And that tells you a lot of what you need to know, because the advanced level is where you've decided to stick with a course of study and you're pushing yourself to a higher level. And it is quite right that that should have a kind of much more intense academic structure to it, and it might fit in with university study, etc.
hmm
A general certificate of secondary education, however, doesn't have that burden. What a general certificate is saying is, like you've said, the example like the driving test. A general certificate is saying you have reached that general stage of competence
mm,
in a wide range of things. So the two ways that you can think about how you might change grading with a general certificate are that you can think of it in terms of a threshold. So it's a pass or a fail, and then you do something else beyond it to do a kind of finer grained, and it may well be a descriptor rather than a kind of gradient. So you say you've passed your, the phrase I use in my recommendations in the book is a passport qualification. So you say, right, I've got my
mm,
passport qualification. That says I'm ready, I'm finished school. And then within that passport qualification, it says, within this, I excelled at this. And this was the thing that,
right.
so you can have descriptors within it, which give a bit more, you know, analysis of
Interest.
what you've done, but essentially it's a document saying I got to that level. And then beyond that, you can go on and start going, right, okay, because I've got my passport, I'm now going to specialize in French, and I'll kind of do something that's more graded. There's actually a really interesting suggestion which has come out recently, and I talk about somewhere else, I'm not sure I mentioned it in the book, is the idea of thinking it in terms of music grading.
Mm-hmm.
So what
Yeah.
music grades do is they say, do grade 1, if you pass that, do grade 2. And actually, so each grade is not a measure of how well you did in one test, it's a measure of how much learning you've done. So if you got to
Interesting.
grade 8,
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
saying I have a significant body of learning and skill that I've developed over a number of years. Within that, you still have your distinctions and
Mm.
merits and passes. So there can be a little bit of kind of, recognition within there. But essentially, what you're trying to do is you're trying to use the system to recognize not a ranking,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
instead a volume of
Where you
learning.
right. And interestingly with music, my daughter gave up the piano. I think she was doing grade 2. She said, I'm bored. And I said, okay, but just keep tinkling away. And then she re-entered at grade 4.
Mm-hmm.
Was it 4 or 5? Because she'd carried on practicing to herself.
Yeah.
And so she'd developed a body of knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and they just said, there's no point you doing grade 3.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that makes it more flexible.
Yeah.
I mean, that's harder for the education. I think one of the difficult things is having an education system that copes
Mm-hmm.
with this.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, one of the people who reviewed your book was Michael Gove, and he's known in the UK as someone who championed, having league tables between different schools, and Ofsted, which is the kind of body of inspectors that goes into schools and checks whether they're doing well, and and that it kind of pits schools against each other essentially.
Mm-hmm.
With an aim, and he said, actually, this book proves that we need exams.
Mm-hmm.
This book shows that actually exams are a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in your reflection on that. What do you think is as clear cut as that?
So I loved getting that review, because basically what it said to me was, it said that in the UK there's a very divisive discussion on education, and teachers, you talk to a teacher and it's all kind of people are lovely and reflective, but you go onto Twitter or X or whatever, and you kind of look at it, and everyone's like a prog or a trad, and they're saying, these are the opposing ways of interpreting it.
Mm.
And what I loved about that review was that it was showing that what I was saying was cutting across those
Yes.
lines of argument. So I really, really appreciated it. I did think it was a politician's review. I thought he spent a lot of time using what I'd said to justify what he thinks.
Yes.
But
Yes.
he is right in one sense, as I explicitly say we should not be getting rid of exams. Exams are a really useful pedagogical tool.
Why?
Because basically, if you want to teach someone something, all the cognitive science and also anyone's personal intuition says, well, what you do is you test yourself. That's how you figure out whether you know something. So,
Yes.
to get rid of that as a tool would be, cutting off your nose to spite your face. But I think the point I would make is that the issue isn't exams, it's how we use exams. And it's the kind of using them for this kind of really fine-grained ranking. And I think that, one of the things, so as an English teacher, one of the things that I know is that I can have, and again, I've just been talking to students about this today, a student who was disappointed in their result, I talked to them because actually I know I could have 2 essays in front of me, and one day I'll say essay A is better, and the other day I'll say essay B is better. And actually, there isn't a concrete answer that says, it just is not factually correct. There isn't some kind of absolute standard of essayness that you can call on to say this is the best one. And I think the problem we have in our system is that we have painted ourselves into a corner where we believe that's the case. We believe you actually can make a standard judgment. And when I teach creative writing, I'm a fiction novelist as well, and so I love teaching creative writing. I really relish it. And with my current class, I went to town on this, and I did some great stuff. I thought it was all fantastic, and we produced really interesting bits of writing. And then my colleague marked it, and she said, that they're not going to get a very good mark because they haven't used colons.
Oh.
Like, colons? I never use colons.
Right. Yes.
But
and that's the thing that drives people nuts. Is
exactly,
this kind? Because they're trying to find things that they can actually do tick box exercises over rather than
the
Yeah,
attempt to
interesting.
make everything comparable actually
Yes.
detracts from its educational value. So
Yeah.
I would make a plea for having exams, but like maybe making them less accurate. Like, I know that sounds
How do you do
mental.
that? What do you mean?
Well, just as in, like, not making them less accurate, but like saying, making fewer claims for their accuracy.
Right,
So you do
right.
the exams for an educational purpose, but you're not
Yes,
saying this is the final word, because
yes.
actually they are subjective and there are problems in the methodologies of them.
Yes, and I did A-level English, and I distinctly remember there was another guy in my class. We both got the top grades, and his essays were completely different to mine. They
Mm-hmm.
blew my mind. I was so scared when I read his essays because they were, fine-tooth comb through the texts that we were dealing with, and I thought I can't compete with that. But
Mm-hmm.
I wrote in a completely different way, and somehow we both were considered to be good. And that's the point: is that there's, but I couldn't understand how they were measuring it, and
Yeah.
I still don't really understand today. But I think when you start taking things down to, whether you've got a colon or not, it starts to make it really difficult to appreciate the process and the
Yeah.
wide the breadth of. And interestingly, because the other things are, so we've got tests, but then there is things like, people talk about coursework and then
Mm-hmm.
continuous assessment and teacher-based grades. And I think you've mentioned in your book all those things and why none of them really work as well as a test.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that
Yeah.
right?
So I mean, so if you take coursework as an example, I mean, there's an obvious problem with nowadays, which is half the stuff you get is AI. And,
Yes.
there's
Yes.
like,
Sammy, Wikipedia has copied your homework. What are we going to do about it?
yeah, it's a genuine problem that, but at the same time, there are ways around that.
Yeah.
But like essentially, if you think of one of the key problems in educational terms between students who come from more advantaged backgrounds and those who don't, the key problem is the level of support and structure you have at home.
100%.
And so as soon as you
100%.
make anything reliant on work that's done at home, then that does change the kind of fairness of it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the coursework and obviously continuous assessment, it comes with the burden of the fact that actually you're keeping the pressure on the whole time. So there are different things that come there. But I think one of the best examples, again, I do discuss it in the book, is the extended project qualification,
Mm-hmm.
which some people who have kids in the UK might be familiar with, and it's a fascinating qualification because essentially what it says is go away and do something, and we will assess the process that you go through.
Mm.
So
Yes.
kids can choose to maybe, well, I've had them choose to write a novel or to build a bike or to put on a play or to there's all sorts of stuff that they will end up doing. And it's a really tricky thing to assess because you have to kind of say, if someone starts with a high level of skill and then they just exercise that skill, they're not going to get the grade. They have to start they have to show progress from a low base.
Yes.
They have to show organization. Now the thing with it is that it is massively open to abuse. You could easily, if you wanted to, you could make get loads of people to help you and do a fake project, etc. But the way you avoid that is by having no high stakes attached to it. So when this was designed in partnership with the universities, it was designed as a way of kind of guiding people towards university style study. And they said explicitly it was never going to be asked for as the main part of someone's offer for university. And it's not included in the main part of the performance tables. It has a role in both, but it's not a significant part of them. And so what that means, that takes away the incentive for schools and for students to game it. It means that we as a school can allow kids to fail. We just let them crack on. And it means that actually, because not so much is riding on it, we can use the assessment as something that is educational and about teaching rather than about outcome.
But then don't they just slack off? Because I remember Angela Duckworth, the woman who did the fantastic TED talk on grit, and she said that she said, I'm going to do this whole thing where there's no grading and everything. We're just going to, it's the process that really counts. And she said it was a disaster because the students they only focused on the things where there were grades. So everyone was doing other people's courses and not really bothering with hers. And isn't that always the problem with things like that? Which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, no,
It's a great idea.
it is a real problem. But the extended project, I think, is a good example of where they've got the balance right. So
Right.
what they've done is, there is a grade on it. There is an assessment process.
Right.
So you
Okay.
can kind of, you get an A, B, C, D, E, etc. on it. If you get a good grade, then you can use it to make up for if you've got a bad grade in one of your other A levels. So it
Got you.
can be
Okay.
of use. It's just not the primary use. And because it is, and the key thing from the school's point of view is because it's not measured directly in the performance tables, it takes away that incentive. Whereas, what happens when you have this kind of very, very tight structure of performance tables, league tables, and accountability and ranking, is it means it puts all the onus on the school to get the kids to succeed. And that
Yeah.
has a kind of equal but maybe opposite effect on grit, which is it takes the pressure off the kid and puts it onto the teacher. And you actually often get that thing of the kid turning to the teacher and saying, well, you need to get me this grade.
What are you going to
Because,
do about it?
what are you
Yes.
going to do about it? I
Yeah, the
need more.
customer.
I need intervention, So,
Interesting.
yeah. And, don't get me wrong. I think that what I want to do in this book, and a lot of the stuff I'm trying to talk about, is to talk about paradox in education, to talk about the complexity of it, and to admit the fact that actually there isn't necessarily an answer that is going to solve all of these problems. And that maybe what we need to be doing is thinking which are the problems we can live with and which are the problems that actually we need to address.
What a great way of putting it. Yes, because you can't fix it all.
No.
But, where do we need to actually what road do we need to be focusing on? And
Mhm.
I loved how you talk about how we sort of, a lot of us think about exams as being like maths, where there's a definite answer,
Mhm.
whereas you were saying it's more like English.
Mhm. Mhm.
A life is more like English, with this kind of that things are much more complex than
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
and that if we make people feel like life is all much more like maths,
Mhm.
we're really misleading them.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and it's, and again, I have deep anger burning about this colon issue, but that I always come back to it, because to me that is taking the wonder of something like English and trying to nail it down. It's trying to pin a
Yeah.
butterfly, and I think that you know if everything becomes about rigor and precision in education, then what you lose is the possibility of having those conversations in which you say to a child, one of the things that I say to many of my students is, I'll kind of introduce literature to them, and I'll say to them, ultimately a lot of the time what we're going to be talking about is love. And they go, oh,
Oh,
look a bit freaked out. And I say, no, we all feel love, and I say to them openly what I hope for you to feel in your adult life is I hope you encounter love and you engage with love, and then but I also say love is paradoxical and complicated. So put your hands up if you love your parents. Dutiful. Put your hands up if you've ever said I hate you to your parents. And
yeah.
they'll go up as well.
Yeah.
It's like you have to have both. You have to have that understanding that one doesn't negate the other, and that actually, that complexity is the texture of life. And if we don't teach people that in schools, then we're not readying them for life.
Yes, and I love that as a way of saying, well, this is the problem with just having a tick box exam
Mm-hmm.
situation where it's you fail or you
Mm-hmm.
win. And I just want to come back to this whole concept of schools as communities
Mm-hmm.
within communities, and this the language of them being part of a crew.
Mm-hmm.
And I what's really interesting is what happened in COVID, where kids were denied access to a social community. Kids were not in school, and I remember listening on the radio and people saying, "Oh, for some kids this is such a relief; they don't have to go in every day. It's very traumatic for them." But I think for a lot of kids, my kids
Mm-hmm.
particularly, as well as lots of kids I know, found it really, really stressful,
Mm-hmm.
depressing, difficult, and they missed out on so many skills
Mm-hmm.
and so many interactions that they need to build a whole person.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be so interested in how you think that so how COVID affected the narrative of what school is for, because the worry I have is that with all this absenteeism, people are going, well, we've proved you don't need to go to school,
Mm-hmm.
you don't need to be there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like it. certainly changed my opinion on it, because I think until COVID, I'd never properly considered the role of school as childcare. Like on a
Yeah,
really
yeah, yeah,
basic
absolutely.
level,
Mm.
society ground to a halt because you can't actually manage your work while you've got your kids sitting there, and certainly with young kids, actually you need
Toddlers coming
place.
in the background while you're trying to
Yeah,
talk.
exactly. And the thought experiment that I've posited with people sometimes is, if I said to you I could give you a pill that you could feed your child and it would just drop all the knowledge they needed into their head at the age of 12, would you then be happy with them just going out and living their adult life? And
No,
obviously I would hope most
no,
go, no, I don't want them. you know
no.
So that tells you
Oh,
instantly that actually
yeah,
school is not just about the delivery of knowledge. It's a place for them to grow. It's a place for them
yeah,
to be as they're growing up. Now, I think what's really interesting in this is, I'm sure this is a book which you and your listeners have encountered, the Anxious Generation by
yeah.
Jonathan
Jonathan
Haidt.
Hay. Yes.
And I think it's a really interesting book. I think it's powerful for schools because it gives us essentially ammunition for making
Mm,
the case for smartphone-free schools, which I think is the right thing. I don't think I think it's more polemical than perhaps all the evidence justifies. I think but that's fine. It's a useful book to exist in the public sphere. Um, but I think the thing that people perhaps are not paying enough attention to in it is his discussion of free range childhood and risk in
yeah.
childhood and social interaction. And what he ends up saying, I think, more powerfully than his stuff about phones, I think really his issue with phones is that it stops other interactions. And I think it's the other interactions which we need to focus on, that kids need to have that social space in order to test themselves against norms, to establish who they are, to slowly kind of detach themselves from their parental home.
Mm,
And, essentially that is, rightly or wrongly in our society, we've set it up that school is the place in which you do that.
hmm.
And school is a place that we make safe for children so that they then can have those interactions and develop in ways that their own inclinations guide them. And I think if we just see it in terms of the knowledge delivery system, then we're missing something really, really profound. And I'll actually, it's not also, everything is entwined here. I'm it's my EM Forster moment. Only connect. It's all together. And I talked to a young man today who'd passed his GCSE English Literature, and it was a brilliant, brilliant result for him, because he'd asked me 3 years ago. He was absolutely on track for exclusion. Really, really problematic kid. Lots of difficult things going on with him, and there he was. I talked to him about how he was going to change his attitude, how he was talking about going on to do football at college, and he's saying, "Yeah, I've learned so much this last year. I'm not going to be antagonistic and so on." And yet, you're thinking that I'm leading towards the point at which school fixed him. No, he got a really nice girlfriend. And she was
Yeah,
lovely, and that settled him. And
yeah.
he spent all year with her rather than his, more
Moat.
destructive mates. So he knuckled down, and she showed him a different route. And I think that is something that money can't buy. But again, it makes my point that the things that are going on with kids are not they're not simple. We can't reduce them to a grade or a number or a moment or a policy. We have to somehow make schools places in which there's space for growth.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way to end this. What I've said to my daughter, who's just got her GCSE results, is all the way through. I kept saying to her, "I'm so much more interested in what you learn about yourself
Mm-hmm.
than any grade you get at the
Mm-hmm.
end of it, because it's the journey, it's the way we grow and develop, and Yeah, and it's not a journey to, it's not a kind of like just get it done and then you're an adult. There's so much going on, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Um, Thank you so much for being with us today. It's such a vital topic, and I know our entire community feels very strongly about it. I'll put your book details into the podcast notes. And if they want to find you online, where would listeners go?
So I'm on LinkedIn, and along with lots of education, I am on X/Twitter, but a lot of us are kind of moving over to Blue Sky. So
I saw you signing up for that.
yeah,
Yes.
so you can find me on there. If you just search Sammy Wright, I think you can locate that. But what I would say is that anyone who wants to get in touch, I'm always happy to talk
Fantastic.
over these issues.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant book. I love it. That's it for now. If you found it interesting as a listener, why not pass it on? Just ping somebody else and say, hey, listen to this. It's really good. You can listen to any of my other interviews and episodes at www.teenagersuntangled.com. Feel free to email me at teenagersuntangled@gmail.com. I get lots of questions. Love putting them on the podcast. And you could even leave a review. That's it. Have a great week. Bye-bye for now. That's it.
Excellent. Oh, that